Hello, this is aloe vera, quite a common houseplant. You probably recognise it. I've got a small plant here in my hands and a slightly larger version of the same plant to my left, although it is a little bit deceptive because that plant is actually 5 of those clumped together in one pot. And the reason for that is because that's how this plant propagates it in its native environment. It shoots out little pups, as you can see here at the base of this one. So that's one of the ways you can propagate the aloe vera. There are other ways of propagating it, and I'm going to talk to you about that in this video. In this video, I'm going to give you a guide to aloe vera, including repotting, watering, the location it likes, and some interesting facts and figures about the aloe vera. Now, it looks and feels like a succulent. It's got those kind of leathery leaves that are full of water, so it clearly would enjoy a hot, arid, Mediterranean style climate. I've also seen these in the Caribbean. In fact, my earliest memory of this plant was in the Caribbean when I was sat on a beach looking at my sunburn when a chap came along and offered me a piece of aloe vera to rub it on. And that's one of the interesting and unusual things about this plant. It is seen as quite a medicinal plant. The jelly inside these leaves can be used to treat burns and sunburns and wounds. However, other parts of the plant are toxic and can give you an upset tummy. In fact, some of the plant is used in laxatives. So there we go. Don't ever ingest or eat the plant, but you can use the jelly inside the cut surfaces of the leaves to treat a burn or a wound. So let's talk about potting this plant on. This is a new addition to my collection, and I bought this simply because it had this pup on the bottom. When you repot this plant, it's best to do it in a heavy, wide-bottomed pot like this one here. And the reason for that is it is quite top heavy. There's a lot of weight up here in this plant because it's a lot of water actually in these thick, juicy leaves. So repot it in a plant with a very wide base because it is prone to toppling over, especially if it's outside in the wind. Try and avoid tall, narrow pots. When you do repot it, it needs to be in very well drained soil. This plant has the type of roots that can get nutrients out of parched, infertile, really not very healthy soil. So you can put it into grit or soil and sand. So that's the tip on repotting it. A wide pot that's very, very well drained. Now, in terms of watering, do not water it for a month after you've repotted it. Let the roots start to grow again and re-establish. If you start watering it straight away after you've repotted it, it might start to rot the root. So let it stay dry. There's plenty of hydration in these leaves for it to continue living. So don't water it for a month after you've repotted it. And then, even then, only water it very sparingly. It's far better to underwater this plant than it is to overwater it. And if you do overwater it, the first signs you'll see will be the leaves, all these stems, thick juicy leaves will start to go brown and wilt. And when they start to wilt, you might be tempted to give it more water, but what you're actually doing is adding to the problem, because the reason it's suffering is because it's got too much water and some of the roots can't breathe and are actually suffocating and possibly starting to rot. So be very, very careful about how much water you give this. Give it less than it needs rather than more than it needs. Now, it does come from very hot, dry, arid places, and you'd think, well, that means it needs lots of light, but in actual fact, it doesn't want direct sunlight. It does like bright light. It loves bright light, but it doesn't want bright sunlight. And funnily enough, the leaves can actually turn red in bright, direct sunlight, a kind of sunburn, which it will recover from eventually. But the best thing to do is not go there in the first place and avoid putting this plant in direct sunlight. And that's if you're keeping it outdoors. Now, you can keep this plant outdoors. And in actual fact, it is hardy. And there are people who keep these outside all year round in the UK and find them to be hardy plants. But the danger is not the cold. the danger is the cold and the wet together. So if you are going to keep this outside, put a cover on it so that the rain doesn't get to it in the cold season when it's not growing. Of course, don't water it, and then plant it obviously into very, very well drained soil. So overwatering and too much direct sunlight are common problems with this plant. Now, I've already mentioned one of the very common things about this plant, which is the fact that the jelly can cure burns or soothe burns. Another thing about this plant is it's said to be air purifying. It's one of those plants that if you have it in the house, it can remove things like formaldehyde from the air. So it's a good plant to have around. But it's got these spiky serrated edges to its leaves, which are actually quite sharp. So do be careful if you've got young children or pets, because they actually could scratch someone quite badly. In addition to that, the end of the leaves are quite sharp and spiky, a bit like an agave. And if you think agave, these are a similar type of plant in terms of care. So again, sharp points to the leaves means that you've got to be very careful where you locate it. And again, locate it somewhere where it won't get knocked, because it is so heavy at the top, it will just topple over. And I will need to put this into a different pot, because in actual fact, this light plastic pot is not enough to support the top. I've put that one into a lovely terracotta pot. The benefit of terracotta is it's breathable, so it will let the roots beneath the plant dry out and breathe, and it will help it to dry out more quickly, because as I've already mentioned, and I'm repeating myself, the enemy of this plant is wet roots. So make sure you plant it in very gritty soil so that the water can flush through it. You don't really need to feed this plant very much at all, once every couple of months in the growing season. But don't feed it at all when it's not growing. Of course, it will stop growing when the light and the temperature drops. But even in a terracotta pot, let it dry out completely between waterings. So let's briefly talk about propagation. I've already mentioned one of the ways you can propagate this plant, and that is by the fact that it kind of has babies. It produces little babies at the base here. That is a little pop for this plant, the parent plant. Allow that to get to about a third of the size of the parent plant before you try to divide it. And then at some point you will be able to divide that off from the parent plant. Obviously try and take some roots with it, so you need to wait until it's established enough to have its own little root system, and then you can just pull it away from the parent plant and plant it up into very gritty soil. So that's one way of propagating it. Now there's 5 of those in there, and in the springtime I'll probably take that apart and produce 5 different plants, and that's another way that you can do it by division. Another way you can propagate them is through leaf cuttings. So, for example here where this leaf has been damaged and saggy, I will just cut that off and I will make some leaf cuttings out of it. And it's quite straightforward. You slice them along the length like that into sections, and then you sit them in a warm room and just let them sit there for up to a week, and let the ends where the cut ends are form calluses, so almost healed over. And you might be thinking, well, what's the point of that? It's just going to rot and dry out and die off. Well, no, because those calluses are where the root will start to form. And then after a week, when it's calloused over, you plant it vertically with the top end pointing up, obviously, and you plant it into some gritty soil. And within a month or so, it should start to produce little tiny pups at this end. It's as simple as that. You don't need any rooting powder. You can just put them in there. So that one there that's bent and broken, I will cut off. I did those about 4 days ago. That was a damaged leaf off this plant. I'll be planting those in about 4 days time, and you'll be able to see that in another video on my channel. And there are benefits to that, because I've left the price on this one. That plant there cost me £10. This one here I bought from Canary Wharf, and it only cost me £15, and there's 5 of them in there. So in my mind, I've got great value here, especially when it comes to the fact that I can divide that up and make 5 good plants like this one out of that. and then they'll all start to produce little babies, and I'll be able to put those plants on my plant bench outside my house and sell them to people walking past. So there we are, 2 ways of propagating it. Firstly from these pups, which is the same as division, which is what I'm going to go do with that one eventually, and by taking leaf cuttings. Watch out for the leaf cuttings video where you see the results on my channel. And so that's the end of this little guide to aloe vera, a pretty self-sufficient and low maintenance houseplant. But do be careful with these sharp spiky leaves. Hope you found that interesting and informative. If you got any additional comments that you want to add, please do feel free to put them in the comments box below this video. And if you want to see how these cuttings turn out, then subscribe and hit the notifications bell. I'll see you soon for some more aloe vera adventures. Bye for now.